Hey everyone, Richard here with this week's reading of Shard of the Sun. So we will just jump into it. Chapter 9. Broderick was exhausted. The constant traveling, with only an occasional stop over the last few days, was taking its toll. Their mounts trotted along at an easy pace. It was hard for him to enjoy the scenery. It was even harder to keep his eyes open. He looked at Kira to see how she was faring. If she was tired, it didn't show. We should reach Ravendale late tonight, possibly early in the morning. Roderick had grown accustomed to her voice now. She was demanding and strong-willed. Her milky white eyes, which had first unnerved him, now gave him a longing that he found thrilling. He didn't know if she felt the same, but he hoped that their paths together did not end at Ravendale. Their horses were just as exhausted as they were, and they were not able to make it to the city limits before having to stop. They set up camp, but decided not to set a watch this night. They were close enough to the city that armed patrols would spot the goblins that had been following them if they dared come near. They ate what little remained of their provisions, which consisted of some bread that had started to go stale and some apples. When they got ready to go to sleep, Kira made her bed startlingly close to his. He didn't say anything, choosing instead to watch her wordlessly. He finally lay down and stared up at the sky. Now that he was able to go to sleep, he found it eluding him. He cursed his mind for keeping him awake. "Do you think I am pretty?" Kira's voice startled him. He thought she had fallen asleep already. His heart battled his mind for what felt like hours. Should he answer honestly? What if she was using him? What if she wasn't? "I think you are beautiful," he said finally, hesitantly. He thought he could see her smile. "I must admit, you have really grown on me." Kira's heart soared. Could someone really care for her? She kept reminding herself that he had saved her life. Not just anyone would do that. She moved her bed next to his and lay down, facing him. They stared at each other for long moments. She leaned over slowly, her body trembling. Their lips met, and fire burned through Broderick's body. Their kissing became more passionate, and his hands began to explore her body. He opened her robes and found to his delight that she wore a shift. The material was so sheer it essentially revealed everything. No wonder she wears robes. His left hand wandered between her thighs, and she gasped in pleasure. She quickly removed the shift, revealing the glory of her body to him in full. His breathing was quick and shallow. He allowed her to remove his clothing as well. She pushed him down and straddled him. "I hope you are ready for this," she whispered. Dawn came all too quickly. Roderick woke up, sun shining on his face. He rolled over and found Kira still sleeping. She was dressed, which made him pause to wonder if perhaps he had dreamed it all. Looking under his blanket revealed that it was no dream. He got up and clothed himself. With the sun shining, he could clearly see Ravendale in the distance. He left the camp to relieve himself and found Kira awake when he returned. "Good morning," he greeted her. Her smile seemed to encompass her entire face. "How did you sleep?" she asked, crawling out of her bed. "Better than anything in the past week. What about you?" He offered his hand to help her, and she stood up. "Very good." She leaned up and kissed him. They were both in a good mood and quickly packed up their things. Roger could see storm clouds heading their way. They mounted their horses and headed toward Ravendale. The dark clouds seemed to approach the city as they did. "How do we get into the city if it is protected?" he asked Kira as they rode. His eyes flicked between the clouds and the city. "Everything should be already arranged. We should be able to walk right in." He was surprised it would be so easy. Back in Muirwood, she made it sound as though it was some near to impossible task. This would make rescuing his cousin's wife much easier. They were less than a league from the city when the storm hit. Powerful winds whipped at their clothes and buffeted them, threatening to throw them from their horses. The rain came down in a torrential downpour and soaked them almost immediately. They fought against the wind and urged their mounts onward. It took the better part of an hour, with the bad weather, to reach the borders of Ravendale. As they approached the city, Broderick could make out the invisible shield that covered the city. The rainwater rolled right off of it. It was an impressive sight. Kira motioned him to stop before they reached the barrier. "We should be able to ride through," she shouted, trying to be heard over the wind and rain. "We don't need to enter through the front gate. We will enter through the east gate. Just follow me." He nodded in acknowledgement. They traveled along the outside of the barrier, only visible because of the rain. A short wall surrounded the outside of the city. With a magical barrier protecting them, they had no need of traditional defenses. When they reached the east gate, the storm seemed to strengthen considerably. It was too hard to stay atop the horses, and so they dismounted. The wind was blowing so fiercely that Broderick feared he would be swept up into the sky. Kira pointed at the barrier. "You first," she shouted. He nodded. "What happens if your plans have fallen through?" he asked. "You'll probably be burned to death." Broderick lost his courage. She stared at him intently, her white eyes searching him, searing him. He shrugged the fear away. She had allowed him into her bed, so why would she lead him to his death? He turned to the barrier and held his hand out. He took a step, and another, and another. He could hear a humming sound. Gritting his teeth, he put his hand on the barrier. Nothing happened. He could feel the invisible force field, but it didn't burn him. He was relieved. Perhaps Kira had been kidding. Then he heard a crackling. Then he heard a cracking sound. Broderick removed his hand, and there was a small crack in the barrier where his hand had been. It began to snake out, forking in different directions and spreading everywhere. His eyes widened as the entire barrier was covered in the small cracks. A glaring yellow light began to burn within them, and the humming sound became erratic. The cracking sound got louder. Suddenly, the barrier exploded. Broderick was thrown to the ground by the force. The air blasted from his lungs. He gasped for air and watched as the barrier disintegrated before his eyes. He looked hurriedly to Kira to make sure she was all right. She was still standing, her eyes alight with a fire that could not be quenched. She strode past him and entered the gate. He reached out for her, but she didn't bother to look back at him. She disappeared into the city. After several minutes, with air back in his lungs, he was able to stand and struggle to his feet. His chest burned. He grabbed a sword from the saddle of his horse and tied it to his belt. Where did she go? Worried, he went into the city in search of her, leaving the horses tied up at the wall. Hate burned within Kira. She walked through the streets, searching for the right building. She hadn't seen it in years, so she didn't remember what it looked like, but Skiram had described it to her. She had summoned the demon again after Broderick had fallen asleep. She regretted leaving him behind, but she was determined to do this herself. She didn't want him to know. Commotion and chaos were erupting in the streets. People were shouting and running about. "They know their shield is gone." She ignored everyone. Pulling out a piece of parchment, she looked it over quickly. Skiram had given it to her. It was a map of Ravendale. Squares and lines outlined various buildings and streets, detailing every section of the city. She looked up and matched her location to the map. Almost there. The building was nondescript. It didn't stand out or have a sign out in the front. Even so, everyone who lived in the city knew what it was. The church. Kira paused at the main entrance. She didn't doubt that it would be guarded, and the priests would no doubt be in an uproar. She looked at the map again, to where she had marked the secret entrance. She would have to be quick. She walked along the building and found the hidden entrance. Kira slid in quietly, and was almost run over by a messenger running past. He offered a hasty apology without slowing his pace, and was quickly out of sight. She unsheathed the dagger hidden in her boot. The demon had informed her that it was difficult to navigate the building. It was purposefully designed to be like a maze in the event of an attack, back before the priest created the barrier. She passed an ornately decorated door and heard raised voices. She pressed her ear to the door and listened. "We don't know how it happened," someone said, a note of fear in their voice. "What do we do?" another said. She heard many voices all talking at once. One voice, in particular, caught her attention. "Silence!" The other voices quieted. "We must guard the city against our enemies until we can restore the shield. Station priest at each gate. I have ordered the council to convene immediately. You are all dismissed." She heard people moving around and expected them to exit, so she hid in a corner. When the door didn't open, she moved back to see what she could hear. She could make out the same voice muttering curses. She knew it was him. Kira tried the door. It was locked. It seemed the door was really just for decoration. She had to get in that room. She slid the blade of the dagger in the crack of the door and gently shifted it from side to side. She felt the blade press against something movable, and smiled. She pushed harder and felt the lock click. The door opened slightly. She peered into the room through the crack. Years had passed, yet she still recognized him, and now she would have her justice. Kira? Roderick touched her arm. She jerked away, startled, and growled at him. You shouldn't be here, she hissed. Why? What's going on? He was confused. She pointed to the way they had come in. Wait for me outside. Roderick raised his brow questioningly, but made no move to obey. We are here to rescue Octavia. Now, who do I speak with to free her? Kira could hear the sound of more people entering the room. I don't have time for this, she yelled. Turning, she flung the door open and rushed in, her dagger glittering in the light of the room. Several men were seated, and more were entering. She saw him sitting at the head of the table. So that's what he was now. Her father was the head of the warrior priests. All right, that's it for this week. Come back next week for chapter 10, and we will continue on. Thanks for listening, and I hope you guys are enjoying the story.